Distinguished guests and friends, on behalf of the Stevenson Center on Democracy, a very warm welcome to you all. Our program on the Korean Peninsula marks the 60th anniversary of the Armistice. And incidentally, it's the 60th anniversary of the first of my many missions in East Asia. Marine Corps tank platoon commander in Korea. June 25, this very day, in 1950, the DPRK, North Korea, crossed the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. Our speakers are eminently qualified to discuss the perilous conditions which persist in the Korean Peninsula and the way forward. That's our purpose, not just to study the past, but to help chart a way forward. Friday afternoon, we were informed by the MacArthur Foundation staff that Ambassador Gallucci regretted he was unable to attend. He has been very ably replaced by Professor John Mearsheimer. I will introduce the speakers and invite them without further ado to follow the other. And at the end of their presentations, we will invite your questions and comments and interaction between our speakers. Professor Bruce Cumins, is the Swift Distinguished Service Professor and Chairman of the History Department at the University of Chicago. He is the author of innumerable books and articles on Korea and East Asia, the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, a consultant and commentator. Professor Cumins is widely considered the preeminent U.S. authority on North Korea. His flight to Chicago from Virginia, where his wife is the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia, his flight was canceled. And our poor speaker was forced to rise at 3 a.m. this morning to get another different flight to Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer, John Mearsheimer, is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Program on International Security Policy at the University of Chicago. A graduate of West Point and an Air Force veteran, he also has a PhD in political science from Cornell. Professor Mearsheimer has had fellowships at Harvard and the Council on Foreign Relations. He's written extensively on security issues and international politics and is the author of 5 books and innumerable articles, the recipient of many awards. We are more grateful to our speakers than I can say, and the more so given the difficult circumstances. This program originated at a conference on Korea in Vienna, hosted by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Austrian Center on Strategic Studies, which I addressed. This program is expected to be part of an ongoing effort aimed at helping bring peace and denuclearization to the peninsula. So let me first call on the president of the center, Dr. Francis Mautner-Markhof, a longtime international civil servant at the International Atomic Energy Agency and a close observer of the Korean Peninsula, who has journeyed here from Vienna without mishap. Following Dr. Mautner-Markhof's remarks, we will hear first from Professor Cumins and then Professor Mearsheimer.
Thank you.
Francis, you were wired.
Okay, do you want me to speak now or not later? Okay. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank the Stevenson Center for this invitation on this very timely and important issue. My remarks today will focus primarily on the way forward. We have observed that regarding policy towards North Korea, disengagement, strategic patience, and strategic impatience do not seem to be having the desired effect. Something?
Can you not hear out there? They're having difficulty hearing, maybe.
Okay. Is this okay? Okay. Right. So to begin again, we have observed that the policy of disengagement, strategic patience, and strategic impatience do not seem to be having the desired effects and results. New methods of engagement and new ways forward are urgently needed to prevent a hardening of positions unfavorable to security, peace in Northeast Asia. The way forward must include measures to build trust and confidence, leading to a denuclearized Korean Peninsula, a peace treaty to replace the Armistice Agreement, and a mechanism for cooperation on security and development in Northeast Asia. That is to say, a comprehensive approach. In this connection, it may be observed that these goals were included, firstly, in the joint statement of the six-party talks of 19 September 2005, and the commitments therein of the six parties. And secondly, in the initiative of DPRK of 16th of June of this year. Negotiating and achieving these objectives will utilize various bilateral and multilateral fora, including the six-party talks. The work of our institute, in cooperation with the OSCE, has focused especially on the goal of achieving a cooperation mechanism for peace, security, and development in Northeast Asia, and the relevance of the OSCE experience, and also of the Helsinki Accords for achieving such a mechanism in Northeast Asia. The main results and recommendations of the last meeting we held in Vienna in November of last year, which was co-organized by the OSCE and our institute, and in which Senator Stevenson took part, include the following. I'll just briefly summarize them for you. Firstly, there is an important OSCE CAC experience relevant to multilateral security cooperation in other regions, for example, regarding comprehensive security and confidence building measures. The existing six-party talks and its working group on a mechanism for peace and security in Northeast Asia can be used as a framework for starting multilateral security cooperation. The six parties have agreed on elements of a regional multilateral structure to be developed through the activities of this working group, in keeping with the joint statement of the six-party talks of September 19, 2005, which states, among other things, the six parties agreed to explore ways and means for promoting security cooperation in Northeast Asia. Guiding principles for multilateral security cooperation in Northeast Asia have been developed within this working group and based to a large extent on the Helsinki Final Act, as well as the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These include principles addressing rules of conduct, rights and responsibilities of each participating state, territorial integrity and independence, areas for cooperation, confidence and security building measures, as well as principles regarding the human dimension. We recommended that to take into account the OSCE principles and experience, such as acknowledging the core security interests of all states involved, equality of states, consensus, and maintaining a permanent forum for dialogue without preconditions, as well as taking into account existing bilateral and other security agreements, and building security as comprehensively as possible. Finally, in this connection, it may be noted that despite its often hostile rhetoric, the DPRK seeks a normal, non-hostile relationship with the US. Its overriding aim is to ensure the survival of its regime and its security. It has been noted by those closer to DPRK that this country is less fragile than assumed by some, and in a realistic policy for achieving denuclearization, peace, and security on the Korean Peninsula cannot be based on the expectation of the collapse of the DPRK regime. Also, it is very important to improve inter-Korean relations, including economic, humanitarian, cultural, and humanitarian initiatives. Such negotiations can and should proceed in parallel. So I think I will leave it for now. Thank you very much, Adlai.
Professor Cumins.
Well, I'd like to thank Adlai Stevenson for inviting me. I thank all of you for coming out. And what I'm going to talk about is the fruits of engagement with North Korea over a 20-year period. Really a little bit less than 20 years, but it starts 20 years ago in 1994 up to 2008. And I wanted to say as an aside that I consulted with Dennis Rodman before I prepared these remarks. So, North Korea, unlike Iran today or Saddam Hussein's Iraq back in the 1990s, has generally responded well, or certainly in the 1990s responded well to American and South Korean overtures for engagement going back to the near war of June 1994. Shortly after that crisis, which was really the worst crisis since the Korean War, in October, the North agreed to freeze its plutonium complex, and it kept it frozen for 8 years. It had no access to plutonium for nuclear weapons during that period. In the last 2 years of his presidency, Bill Clinton, with Ambassador William Perry as his in the lead, also was on the verge of making an agreement to buy out North Korea's medium and long-range missiles, meaning that North Korea would not have a delivery capability for atomic warheads. Meanwhile, from 1998 to 2008, for a 10-year period, Presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun radically restructured South Korea's strategy toward the north with many achievements, the biggest one being the Kaesong export zone, where South Korean firms employ some 53,000 North Koreans. Its operations have been suspended for the last few weeks, but it is a very important enterprise. And also important agreements signed at the second summit between Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il in October 2007 that would have established, among other things, a peace regime in the West Sea where there have been many clashes, most recently or famously the sinking of the Cheonan South Korean naval ship with significant loss of life. All this flies in the face of commentary that we hear whenever there's some kind of crisis with North Korea, claiming that the North cheats, that it can't be trusted to carry out agreements, or that all it really wants is nuclear weapons. The crisis of the early 1990s began 20 years ago. On March 12, 1993, when North Korea announced that it was withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Leslie Gelb, who was head of the Council on Foreign Relations at the time, argued that North Korea's nuclear activity will bring on the next crisis, where another bad guy, in his words like Saddam Hussein, may soon test the mettle of what he called the sane nations. John Murtha, a Democrat of Pennsylvania, said North Korea had become America's greatest security threat and urged that President Clinton knock out North Korea's nuclear facilities with smart weapons. By this time, it was routine for influential American analysts to argue that Kim Il-sung was evil or insane or both, and that, if necessary, these facilities should be taken out by force. For North Korea, however, this crisis began 3 days after Bill Clinton took office in January 1993, when he said he would go ahead with the largest war games in the world, the so-called Team Spirit war games, which George Bush had suspended a year earlier and then revived for 1993. Team Spirit games routinely include the introduction to Korea of nuclear-capable aircraft and naval ships of all types, backpack nukes controlled by mobile units, practice with nuclear cannons, with many South Korean Army units working together with the Americans on various nuclear war scenarios. It's a basic principle of the NPT that countries that have nuclear weapons should not be threatening those that don't possess them. And since the demise of the Soviet Union, American war games in Korea aimed primarily at the North. This crisis was accompanied by one war scare after another. I don't want to go into the details of that, but it's important to realize that the crisis that blew up in March and April of this year may have been more extreme than most of them, but to me it reminded me most of all of what happened back in 1993 and 94. It's really nothing new. The North Korean position was that the International Atomic Energy Agency had no right to see a particular site, a so-called waste site, that it thought might indicate how much plutonium North Korea had produced. The NPT had never asked to inspect a non-declared nuclear site. In other words, the treaty works by countries declaring their nuclear sites. In this case, North Korea had not declared this site, and the IAEA, under extreme American pressure, wanted to see it. They still haven't seen it. In 2013, they still have not seen what is in that waste site. At any rate, the Clinton administration, which was obsessed with nonproliferation to begin with, became obsessed with getting the DPRK to comply with the IAEA. Meanwhile, the DPRK voiced its perennial fear, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, that the U.S. simply wanted to obliterate its existence as a state. In June and July 1993, the North Koreans had made a proposal that you could only read about in the North Korean press, and that was to replace their graphite reactor, which makes their plutonium, with light water reactors. And I remember both thinking and writing at the time that it's a curious crisis where you have to read the rogue state press as well as our press in order to figure out what's going on. But that proposal turned out to be the key to unlocking the crisis that occurred after North Korea, in a very provocative manner, unloaded 8,000 fuel rods from its reactor in May of 1994. They had unloaded fuel rods only once before in 1989, and that was the basis for a decade-long CIA estimate that the North Koreans had 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. The amount of plutonium downloaded in 1989 was only enough for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. I think, in retrospect, it's clear they did not have 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but the CIA testified every year in the 90s that that was their estimate. Anyway, pulling 8,000 fuel rods out, giving them the wherewithal for maybe 8 or 9 nuclear weapons, called Washington's bluff and left administration officials with no apparent room for maneuver. By mid-June, the Clinton administration had developed a plan for laying out the first steps for the U.S. to go to war, which included sending 10,000 American troops to Korea, Apache attack helicopters, various other things. To make sure that President Clinton understood the dimensions of a new war in Korea, the Joint Chiefs brought General Gary Luck back from Korea, the commander in Korea, who told President Clinton that he would need 80,000 to 100,000 body bags in the field for the American soldiers who would die in a new Korean war, and Korean troop casualties would reach hundreds of thousands. Moreover, if the North struck Seoul as expected, with its artillery guns and various other means, the number of civilian casualties would be staggering. The cost of such a war, General Luck thought, would be at least $500 billion and could top $1 trillion, far higher than the almost $60 billion spent on Desert Storm, a sum largely borne by American allies. As many of you would remember, President Jimmy Carter got wind of the possibility that the U.S. was going to preemptively strike North Korea. He flew to Pyongyang and became the first American president, current or former, to meet with Kim Il-sung. And out of that meeting came an agreement to freeze the plutonium facilities at Yongbyon, and that was codified in the so-called October Framework Agreement. It's very important, especially given all the blather about North Korea cheating all the time, to realize that UN inspectors were on the ground from October 1994 until late 2002, 24 hours a day. The reactor was sealed. It was under surveillance by video cameras controlled by the UN, and it was inert. The U.S. doesn't have good human intelligence on North Korea, so we surveil them by every means necessary. I'm sure Mr. Snowden has some good documents on how we, our international proctology with North Korea. And one of the things we do is monitor heat, literally, a tank starting up on a cold morning. So our monitors are fully capable of knowing whether that plutonium reactor was functioning or not, and it didn't function for 8 years. Not much happened between 1994 and 98 when Kim Dae-jung was inaugurated. Kim, of course, had been a dissident who was nearly murdered by the Chun Doo-hwan regime in 1980. But more important, he had come of age in 1945 and really had both participated in the history of post-war Korea and had studied it and understood it. And I had known him since I was a graduate student in 1973 and have great admiration for him. So I suppose that will color what I have to say about him. But I was at the inauguration in 1998, and I was stunned to see him completely transform South Korea's strategy toward the North. In particular, to call for a long period of reconciliation before reunification. South Koreans had expected unification almost as soon as the Berlin Wall fell and Germany got unified. That hasn't happened yet, but it was a reasonable supposition for many people in the 1990s. Kim Dae-jung changed the Southern policy toward the North, which was based on the German model of just absorbing it and extending South Korea's system to the North, and instead talked about a long period of peaceful coexistence while this reconciliation went on, and postponed reunification for another 20 or 30 years until the next generation. He also called for, not at the inauguration, but shortly after, for getting rid of the 50-year-old American embargoes against the North. The North is the most embargoed country in the world and has been for many decades, and most of the embargoes are ours. He also was unflagging in trying to get President Clinton, who was otherwise occupied in 1998, you may remember, to pay attention to the North Korean problem. It was really William Perry who went to Pyongyang in 1999, had a very good visit in the spring, and then in the fall enunciated a number of principles for a new relationship with the North, the most important being that we need to deal with North Korea as it is rather than as we would like it to be. That was a breath of fresh air to me, because most of the commentators in this country who talk about North Korea act as if only we could get the Kim family out of the way, Thomas Jefferson would appear in the North and everything would be hunky-dory. It's just not, hasn't happened and not likely to happen. Anyway, the 1994 agreement was continuing in place, and Ambassador Perry worked out a deal on North Korea's missiles that was deeply in the American interest, to basically indirectly buy out North Korea's medium and long-range missiles, which would deny it delivery capability. I happened to have lunch with William Perry at Stanford a few weeks after George Bush took office in 2001. That very day, Michael Gordon, who's one of the very best investigative reporters on the New York Times, laid out a 2 full-page story about this near agreement, and William Perry validated everything that Michael Gordon said, I think because Michael Gordon spent a lot of time talking to him. Anyway, it's March 6, 2001. You can go back and have a look at it. It's almost forgotten in the general commentary on North Korea. Around October 10th, General Cho Myung-nok, who was one of the top generals in North Korea and ran the conglomerate that makes their missiles and sells them on a world scale, came to the White House. He was on the front page of the New York Times with his full military regalia, his medals making his lapel sag, and he's sitting next to Bill Clinton. Clinton then arranged for Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, to go to Pyongyang 2 weeks later. She worked out an agreement whereby North Korea would limit the range of its missiles to 300 kilometers or 180 miles, which is the same limit South Korea has been under for many decades. If President Clinton would have a summit with Kim Jong-il, which would mean a great deal to the North Koreans, they like getting people to come to their capital rather than going to others, then the North Koreans would enter the missile technology control regime, which would have been a major achievement. But nobody was really paying much attention in October because a presidential election that was very close was being held. It then was thrown into limbo for 6 weeks until the Supreme Court decided that George W. Bush was the president. President Clinton still wanted to go to Pyongyang. I happened to go to a conference in Seoul at around December 20th or 21st, a few days before Christmas, and we, the American delegation to that conference, met with Kim Dae-jung, and on the way out he told me he still had hopes that President Clinton would go to Pyongyang and sign this agreement. But Condoleezza Rice and others who were part of the Bush transition team said they didn't like the agreement. They thought it wasn't verifiable, and it fell through the floor. It fell between the stools. You can read Madeleine Albright's memoirs to see what she thinks of this, this disaster, which it really was. Thereafter, the Bush administration essentially followed a foreign policy of anything but Clinton, the so-called ABC policy, in which, in a very partisan fashion, one policy after another was reversed, and probably Korea policy suffered the most. Bush received Kim Dae-jung in his office in March, shortly after he was inaugurated. It treated him very coldly. When they came out of the Oval Office, he referred to this man, which I think was just a Bushism, but when you translate it into Korean, it was very insulting. Kim Dae-jung had just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, things went downhill from there, and all through the rest of Kim Dae-jung's administration and his successor, Roh Moo-hyun, relations with the Bush administration were about as bad as they've ever been between Seoul and Washington, with a lot of growing anti-Americanism in the South. The Bush administration, however, didn't do much about North Korea until 18 months into their administration, when in September the Bush Doctrine was tabled, which called for preemptive attacks against American enemies, especially those in the axis of evil. North Korea had been placed there the previous January, which in the North was seen as a kind of declaration of war. And along comes the preemptive doctrine, and North Korea is toward the top of the list, with Iraq being number 1. The Bush administration then sent James Kelly to Pyongyang the next month, right on the heels of all this, and accused them of having a second nuclear program to enrich uranium. But basically what they did, and you don't need to take my word for it, Mike Chenoy's book called Meltdown, Mike was the CNN correspondent who went to Pyongyang many times, has a lot of inside information about the degree to which the Bush administration wanted to sabotage the 1994 Framework Agreement, with John Bolton in the lead on that. And that's essentially what happened. And the North Korean response was, again, to withdraw from the NPT, kick out the UN inspectors, recover their 8,000 fuel rods of plutonium that had been stored in concrete casks for 8 years, and they went back to building missiles and nuclear weapons, testing the first one in 2006. President Roh Moo-hyun gamely labored on with the so-called Sunshine Policy, trying to engage the North, and succeeded at the second summit between the two heads of state in October 2007 at arranging a very intriguing political economy program for the southwest of North Korea, which was always the richest part of North Korea. It's where a number of ports come around to Kaesong, where the export zone was being built, and particularly called for a peace regime in the West Sea. I'm just about done, but I'd like to take a couple of minutes to explain that the West Sea, that's what Koreans call it, it's the Yellow Sea to us. There's a northern limit line that was unilaterally extended by General Mark Clark and his South Korean counterparts in August of 1953, after the armistice had been signed. China and North Korea never agreed to this northern limit line, and it's illegal under international law because it threads north of islands that are within 7 miles of North Korea's coast and therefore violate the 12-mile limit that every country is entitled to. Henry Kissinger in 1975, when he was Secretary of State, said this is completely illegal under international law. But what that area and that northern limit line is an invitation to trouble. In 1999, the South Koreans blew a North Korean ship out of the water, and 25 or 6 North Korean sailors lost their lives. I remember reading about that and thinking, well, they're not going to take that lying down. In fact, they did take it lying down, and that was because, unbeknownst to me or anybody else, they were building up toward a summit the following June, the first summit in 2000. There were many more incidents that often have mundane causes. They're good crabbing grounds, depending on the season of the year, good fishing grounds, and North Korean ships cross the northern limit line and get fired on. The sinking of the Cheonan has a slightly more complicated background, but it led to an extraordinary confrontation. Later on, Leon Panetta in 2012, when he was Secretary of Defense, said we've been within an inch of war with North Korea for weeks and months. So it was an extraordinary confrontation, but still, there are many responsible people, including physicists who have studied the situation carefully, who believe that Cheonan was detonated by an old mine tethered to the sea bottom there. I don't know. I'm not a physicist. I haven't studied the issue, but it was a murky business, and yet it nearly led to a major confrontation. All of this is, to my mind, just almost insane 60 years after the armistice, that we still have a zone of an indeterminate zone where conflict like this can erupt and then ratchet up into something much larger. So it's important not to be misled by an incident that comes along this year, let's say, and that actually has a long history in that West Sea region. But I think Leon Panetta's statement is worth thinking about. 60 years after the Korean War ended, we're still within an inch of war, a war that would probably escalate to nuclear war. So if that isn't a terrible policy failure, I don't know what is. We went into South Korea with our combat troops in August and in September of 1945, after unilaterally drawing the 38th parallel, to try to keep guerrillas like Kim Il-sung with Soviet support from taking over the peninsula. Now we're dealing with his grandson. And if he lives as long as Kim Il-sung did, if he's 82 years old when he dies, it'll be the 2060s, and we'll still be dealing with the Kim family in Pyongyang. So it's important, A, to think this regime is not likely to go away anytime soon, and B, as Mr. Perry said, it's necessary to deal with it as it is rather than as we would like it to be. I think that historians will look upon Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Bill Clinton, Kim Il-sung, and Kim Jong-il as people who sincerely tried to lessen tension in Korea, probably more than all the heads of state going back to the country's division in 1945. And it underlines the thing that's rarest in the Korean context, diplomacy, on the principle that you have to give up something to get something. You know, at the end of the Korean War, there was supposed to be a peace treaty signed in Geneva at a 1954 conference. It was to deal both with the end of the Korean War, or the Armistice, and with the Vietnam War, with the French leaving after their loss at Dien Bien Phu. Quite a few important agreements were negotiated regarding Vietnam, including dividing the country, but nothing was done regarding Korea. And I once interviewed Hugh Alexis Johnson, who was John Foster Dulles' aide at those meetings, and I had already read the documents, and I knew they knew nothing was going to happen going in. They weren't going to do any diplomacy. So I said, well, Mr. Johnson, how do you prepare for a major conference in Geneva when you know nothing's going to happen? And he says, oh, you get your papers together, and you consult and try and figure out what the other side's going to say, and you make sure President Rhee doesn't get out of line, and you go to the conference. So we went to the conference, and there was no peace treaty coming out of it, and there never has been a peace treaty. We got very close to that again in the late 1990s with so-called four-power talks, not six-power talks, that seemed, from press reports, to be close to a peace agreement to end the armistice. From the American side, it's very hard to figure how we can do a peace treaty because that has to go through the Senate. Anyway, a peace agreement, but it didn't get done, and it remains a core demand of North Korea that I think would be rather easy to satisfy in return for North Korea doing some of the things we'd like them to do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Professor Michon.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate the invitation to fill in for Ambassador Gallucci. And I do, like Bruce, appreciate the fact that everybody came out to hear us speak today. I'm going to make three sets of points. First of all, I'm going to argue that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons, and indeed it would be foolish to do so. Second, I'm going to argue that there's not going to be a reunification of North and South Korea, which many people see as a way of solving the nuclear issue. And then third, I'm going to argue that the proliferation problem is going to get worse in Northeast Asia over time, in large part because Japan and South Korea are going to have very powerful incentives to want nuclear weapons of their own. So let me start first with my argument that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons. Let me say a few words about why nuclear weapons are so attractive. The key thing to keep in mind about nuclear weapons is that they are the ultimate deterrent. Any country that has nuclear weapons is not going to be attacked. And the reason is that the one circumstance under which a state is likely to use nuclear weapons is if its survival is threatened. In other words, if a leader feels that his or her state is on the verge of destruction, there's nothing to lose by using nuclear weapons. In the context of our discussions in this country about Iran, much is made of the fact that once Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's going to be able to dominate the Persian Gulf because nuclear weapons will give it all sorts of offensive capability. This is nonsense. Nuclear weapons have hardly any offensive capability. They are, again, the ultimate deterrent. And any country that feels that it lives in a dangerous neighborhood is going to want nuclear weapons because if it has nuclear weapons, no one is going to attack it. Okay, so that's the great advantage. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, why might North Korea want nuclear weapons? Well, there are a lot of reasons. First of all, North Korea lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. I think there are two states on the planet that have the worst geography. One is Poland, and the other is Korea, both north and south. Norman Davies, a historian at Oxford, wrote a very famous book about Poland called God's Playground. My view is that there are two playgrounds in the world, Poland and Korea. Poland has been situated between Germany and Russia or the Soviet Union, and at one point, it was also situated between Austria, when it was a great power. And Austria, Germany, and the Soviet Union have taken turns gobbling up Poland. Korea, on the other hand, has been situated between Japan, China, and Russia. This is a dangerous neighborhood. You constantly have to be on your guard. To make matters worse from North Korea's perspective, the fact is that South Korea's conventional forces today are much more powerful than North Korea's conventional forces. In 1950, when the North Koreans invaded South Korea, the North Koreans were much more powerful than the South Koreans, which is why they pushed the South Koreans back to the Pusan perimeter, and the United States had to intervene on behalf of the South Koreans. That's not the case today. And many American military officers will tell you behind closed doors that they worry that because the South Koreans are so powerful at the conventional level, they may, in a crisis, think about invading the North. Well, if you're North Korea and you're facing an adversary called South Korea that has conventional superiority, the incentives to get nuclear weapons are very great. So number one, you live in a very dangerous neighborhood, Japan, Russia, China. Number two, the South Koreans have conventional superiority. And then most importantly, you have to deal with the United States of America. The United States of America has a penchant for running around the world, putting its gun sights on various countries and threatening them, and sometimes toppling the regime. Well, if you happen to be an adversary of the United States, and certainly the North Koreans are an adversary of the United States, it makes eminently good sense to have nuclear weapons. You understand that if Iran had nuclear weapons today, the United States and Israel would not be talking about attacking Iran. They're talking about attacking Iran today because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. If North Korea has nuclear weapons, we're not going to attack North Korea. If North Korea does not have nuclear weapons, it's a different story. Now, some people may say that the United States can change its stripes. It can have an epiphany, and it can tell the North Koreans that it won't attack them under any circumstances, and therefore convince the North Koreans to give up their weapons of mass destruction, especially their nuclear weapons. But there's a good reason the North Koreans are not going to be foolish enough to believe this, and that's the Libyan precedent. This is what happened in 2003. In 2003, Colonel Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons. He gave up all his programs for developing weapons of mass destruction, and he allowed unconditional inspections. President Bush said at the time, Colonel Gaddafi's commitment, once fulfilled, will make our country more safe and our world more peaceful. And then very importantly, and you want to listen to this, George Bush said, leaders who abandon the pursuit of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them will find an open path to better relations with the United States and other nations. Well, you all know where Colonel Gaddafi is now, right? He's 6 feet under, because our president, that's President Obama, who has a penchant for running around the world and assassinating people he doesn't like, played the central role in killing Colonel Gaddafi. You know what the moral of the story here is, of course. Colonel Gaddafi was a fool to give up his weapons of mass destruction. He should have kept them. He should have moved full speed ahead to develop WMD. Had he done that, he'd probably be alive today. But he was foolish enough to give them up. You think this lesson has been lost on the North Koreans? I would bet it has not. So my bottom line is that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons, and indeed it would be foolish to do so. Now, some people say, what you're missing, John, is the fact that the Chinese are very unhappy with the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and it's the Chinese who will put pressure on the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. I have three responses there. First of all, there's no question the Chinese do not like the fact that the North Koreans have been testing their nuclear weapons. And the Chinese worry greatly that those tests will scare the South Koreans, and especially the Japanese, and cause the South Koreans and the Japanese to go nuclear. And if there's one thing the Chinese don't want, it's the Japanese to go nuclear. So what the Chinese would like is for the South Koreans to stop testing their nuclear weapons. But I believe the South Koreans, I believe that the Chinese are not that upset about the fact that North Koreans have nuclear weapons. The other thing is that even if the Chinese tell the North Koreans that they should give up their nuclear weapons, the North Koreans are not going to listen to them for the reasons that I just spelled out to you. Some people would respond to that by saying, but John, China is much more powerful than North Korea, and it has significant leverage that it can use against North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. But in fact, that's not true. This is a classic case of where the small country has great leverage over the more powerful country. And there are significant limits on what the Chinese can do to the North Koreans. And when you talk to the Chinese, I've been in China and talked to numerous Chinese intellectuals and policymakers about this issue. They're very frustrated by how little influence they have on the North Koreans. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why is that the case? This brings me to my second point, which is that there will not be a reunification. And in laying out why I think there will not be a reunification of North and South Korea, I'll explain to you why I think China has so little leverage over the North. China has a deep-seated interest in maintaining North Korea as a buffer state between itself and South Korea, which is the home of 19,000 American troops. You all understand that the Americans and the South Koreans are joined at the hip. They have been joined at the hip since 1950. So that means that if you do have a reunification of North and South Korea, which will surely be done under the auspices of the South Koreans, you will effectively get a unified Korea that will be run by the South Koreans, who are joined at the hip with the United States. That means the Americans and the South Koreans will be right on the Chinese border. Now, many of you in the audience know a lot about the Korean War, and you know that for most of the Korean War, the United States did not fight against North Korea, it fought against the Chinese. And the reason we ended up fighting against the Chinese is that we crossed the 38th parallel. We went from South Korea into North Korea, and we started heading towards the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. The Chinese said this is categorically unacceptable. We didn't take the message, and they came into the war, and we ended up fighting the Chinese from 1950 to 1953. This is all a way of saying that from China's point of view, it's unacceptable for the United States and South Korea to be in North Korea. That means, in my opinion, the Chinese will go to considerable lengths, they'll go to great lengths to make sure that there is no unification of North and South Korea, and that North Korea is preserved as a buffer state. I believe that if North Korea looked like it was imploding, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but if it were to happen, I believe the Chinese would move in very quickly, install a pro-China regime, and go to great lengths to keep that regime in place and keep the South Koreans and the Americans on the south side of the 38th parallel. Because I believe from China's point of view, it's very important to maintain that buffer state, and therefore they will prop up North Korea no matter what. It's the fact that China is so dependent on having that buffer state that allows North Korea to have a great deal of leverage vis-a-vis China. The North Koreans, in my opinion, are well aware that the Chinese need them, and they know that that gives them significant leverage. So that, I believe, is the principal reason it is so difficult for the Chinese to put pressure on the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons, assuming that that's what the Chinese wanted to do. And as I said before, I don't believe that that's the Chinese preferred policy. So my first point to you is, I do not believe North Korea is going to give up its nuclear weapons. And number two, I do not believe there is going to be a unification of South and North Korea that will solve this problem. My third point is that the proliferation problem is likely to get worse. And let me explain why I think that's the case. I believe that if China continues to rise, that there will be an intense security competition in Asia, especially in Northeast Asia, between the United States and China. As you all know, in 2011, the Obama administration announced that they were pivoting to Asia. This pivot to Asia is in large part designed to contain a rising China. The Americans are well aware that China is becoming increasingly more powerful, and it's beginning to throw its weight around in ways that scare a lot of China's neighbors, especially the South Koreans and the Japanese, and that it's imperative for the United States to move into Asia in a big way. Of course, it's already there, but to increase its presence and to send a signal to our allies that we will be there for them, right? And to send a signal to the Chinese that we will contest them if they try to expand in any way. This looks to be defensive from our point of view. We refer to it as containment, but from the Chinese point of view, it looks like encirclement. And the Chinese do not view these American measures as defensive in nature. Well, I think that with the passage of time, what will happen is that an arms race will develop between the Americans and the Chinese, and you will have, as I said before, an intense security competition. This will have all sorts of consequences for both the South Koreans and the Japanese. As you all know, the South Koreans and the Japanese do not have nuclear weapons of their own. Given that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons and that the Chinese have nuclear weapons, that means that the South Koreans and the Japanese have to depend on the Americans for nuclear deterrence. They have to believe that the so-called nuclear umbrella that we will put over their heads will be reliable. Now, we have played this game before. We did it during the Cold War when we had our nuclear umbrella over South Korea and over Germany, which were the two frontline states in the Cold War. In both cases, both countries, South Korea and Germany, were very fearful that we would not use nuclear weapons to defend them. And the South Koreans, during the Cold War, actually started a significant program to develop nuclear weapons of their own. The South Koreans and the Taiwanese began to go down the nuclear road. The Americans found out what they were doing, and the Americans landed on them like a ton of bricks. But all of this is just to say that during the Cold War, where the principal threat from the Soviet Union was not in Asia, but was in Europe, South Koreans and the Taiwanese nevertheless had incentives to develop nuclear weapons of their own. The Cold War is over with. There's no threat in Europe. The threat that looms on the horizon from an American perspective, from the Pentagon's perspective, from South Korea's perspective, from Japan's perspective, is China. And South Korea and Japan live right next door to China. And they're going to have all sorts of doubts about the American nuclear deterrent. And this is going to give them very powerful incentives to want to develop nuclear weapons of their own. And it makes perfect sense from their point of view. It does not make perfect sense from an American point of view. I want to be very clear on this. From an American point of view, the best world is one in which one country has nuclear weapons, us, and nobody else. from an American point of view. But we're not talking about an American point of view here. We're talking about a Japanese point of view, talking about a South Korean point of view, a Taiwanese point of view. And from their point of view, nuclear weapons look awfully attractive. Let me just conclude by positing one scenario that shows you how tricky this issue is going to be for the United States. As most of you know, the Japanese and the Chinese have had a serious conflict over the past few years over some small islands called the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. And it is possible that a major crisis could break out between Japan and China over these islands. And if that were to happen, the question you have to ask yourself is, how should the United States react? We basically have two options. One is we try and act as a neutral force. We try and come in and put great pressure on both Japan and on China not to go to war. Okay, we're kind of like an umpire. That's one scenario. The other scenario is we understand that Japan is our ally, Japan has no nuclear weapons of its own, and Japan is depending on us to cover its back. So we come in a really powerful way on Japan's side. Okay? Which do we pursue? Going to be very powerful incentives to come in and try and be an umpire and try and just shut the conflict down before it escalates. We will surely understand that if we come in on Japan's side, it makes the likelihood of conflict greater. But the problem is, if we come in as an umpire, if we show any inclination to be neutral in a conflict between China and Japan, the incentives for Japan to get its own nuclear weapons are tremendous. So you see, what's going to happen over time as the US-China competition heats up, and as the China-Japan competition heats up, and as the South Korea-North Korea competition continues to fester, the incentives for South Korea and Japan to get nuclear weapons are going to increase. So my bottom line is, not only are we going to have to worry about North Korean nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future, the problem's going to get much bigger. We're going to have to worry about Japanese and South Korean nuclear weapons as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've heard some very thoughtful, very informed, and to some extent provocative comments, which for me at least have not clarified the way forward. Let us start by inviting the speakers to react to one another before we throw it open to the floor. Do either of you gentlemen or Francis want to react to what the other has said?
I can make a comment.
Pardon?
I can make one comment.
Francis?
A very interesting, provocative presentation on the part of John Mearsheimer, and also thank you very much, Bruce, for the background and the important information you conveyed, which I think is necessary. One has to have an understanding historically of where we're coming from in order to go forward. I just want to make a few points. Unification is perhaps not on the horizon, but normalization of relationship between North and South Korea could happen sooner rather than later under let's say, favorable circumstances. It could be, however, that even if one could negotiate a peace treaty to replace the Armistice Agreement, that this would not give North Korea the assurances it requires, although it has maintained in the past that it would accept certain American security guarantees. How that would affect its possession of nuclear weapons remains to be seen. But there is a Another problem which we see occurring right now, which we have to keep in mind, and that is that the United States policy of its pivot to Asia, which you identify, and others also, as sort of a containment. At present, the United States is seeking to expand its ballistic missile defense system to counter what it says is the threat from North Korea. But China sees it somehow differently. In other words, and Russia too for that matter, they both see this as weakening their nuclear deterrence. So the issue is, I would like to say in conclusion, perhaps a bit more complicated, but you have certainly indicated important factors to be considered. Thank you.
I would say that John has captured the post-2002 situation very well in regard to North Korean strategy. Actually, what John said, the North Koreans have said over and over again. In the build-up to the Iraq War, and really right at the time of the invasion, they said, well, let's look at it. Saddam Hussein invited in the UN inspectors. He gave up his WMDs. He was disarmed. That's when the US invaded. And then after the Gaddafi overthrow, they've said the same thing. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult to get nuclear weapons out of their hands. I think, though, that it's instructive, again, to go back to 1999 and 2000 when General Cho came to Washington, and he and Clinton signed an agreement saying neither country will have hostile intent toward the other. Now, I agree with John that North Korea is not going to take a piece of paper and use that as a guarantee that the U.S. Will not attack it. But the Bush administration then came in, and just a few weeks later, and more or less ripped that paper up. And I still remember reading what the North Koreans said. They said, how can you make an agreement between sovereign governments and just disappears overnight? So to some extent, the partisan ABC transition there was important, but I think the events of the first decade of the 21st century, especially the invasion of Iraq, which John and I both opposed, and we had a little study group on that, it was a complete disaster, and it's an unraveling disaster today, whether inside Iraq or out. And one of the disasters that nobody points to is the North Koreans constantly saying we need a deterrent because of what happened in Iraq. They actually brought Siegfried Hecker over in January 1994 to show him their deterrent. Now, I'm no nuclear physicist, but he is. He was the head of one of our nuclear labs. And they took a glass jar with metallized plutonium and put it across the table. And I didn't realize all you need is a glove on your hand to hold a glass of metallized plutonium. Doesn't radiate very much. Well, anyway, Hecker asked them a lot of questions of their nuclear physicists, and got all the right answers, and came back and said he didn't think they had a bomb yet, but they know how to metallize plutonium, which was the key to developing our first atomic bomb. So they couldn't have been clearer in making John's point about deterrence. I don't think today that we can walk the dog back to 1999 or 2000, but for one of the other major points John made about proliferation, I think it's very important to deal with North Korea, to cap their program before they have 20 or 30 bombs and warheads and the capacity, which they already have, to deliver them with mobile missiles. North Korea's long-range missiles haven't done too well. They put up a satellite in December, but their medium-range missiles are very frightening. They're mobile, they're accurate, and they can hit any part of Japan, including Okinawa, where we have tens of thousands of troops. So it's very important to cap the program, because if it's capped, then North Korea can have the satisfaction of possessing a handful of nuclear weapons, and therefore they're not likely to be attacked. But the pressure on South Korea and Japan will not be nearly as great to go nuclear. Thanks.
These discussions of the peninsula always seem to me to focus on the nuclear issue. But there are many issues. North Korea, and I have to admit I've never been there, is suffering. This is a despotic police state. The people are starving, most of them. It's said that the average height of the people of North Korea is some 3 inches shorter than those in South Korea. But what is China scared of? China is scared of the collapse of North Korea and floods of refugees into China and into the north. It has a huge, a very long, and I have been there, common boundary. It's much more exposed than the United States to the instabilities of North Korea. So my question is, and I'm going back to somewhat of an analogy to what we did in Vietnam after the end of the war, where we emphasized the economic, and it was NGOs that did it. We broke down the isolation of Vietnam. It was being isolated by all the ASEAN countries, by the United States. We brought it into the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. That led into APEC. All of the countries normalized relations. The U.S. entered a trade agreement. Vietnam isn't nuclear. Korea has other interests. So as part of a comprehensive package that include humanitarian assistance, economic development assistance, trade and investment, with denuclearization, so-called, as maybe part of a more comprehensive approach, and that for the benefit of many reduces the risk of proliferation, which I think is a very serious, risk in North Korea, as has been mentioned. It's just not North Korea. It's North Korea as a source of proliferation, and not just of the weapons, but of the components, which are already being marketed around the world and capable of being assembled and in small sizes for delivery by missiles. So why shouldn't we always seem to, in the United States, also start with sanctions. China's opening up, and its reform started with its opening up, the end of the isolation. Then we have preconditions, which effectively kill negotiations that are intended to address the preconditions. Why don't we abandon preconditions and try to develop a comprehensive approach that invites participation by the DPRK because it offers investment, humanitarian assistance, integration into the world's most dynamic regional economy, and I'm referring to East Asia. China is already investing big time in North Korea. The Kaesong industrial complex is just a small example of not only what could be done with a multi-pronged approach, but has also already been experimented with. And isn't the Kaesong industry, isn't it being reopened? The attitude that the North Koreans are very sort of unpredictable. All of a sudden, recently, their attitudes become much more accommodative. And I asked one of our speakers a moment ago, well, what was it? Well, apparently it was just a statement by the U.S. that it would not be, it would not deliver an intercontinental ballistic missile in the area, in the region. And that suddenly may have been what triggered a change of attitude, which is sounding much more accommodative from the North Koreans. And if I read between the lines, and frequently from outside the mainstream press, read correctly, they're indicating an interest, especially in bilateral relations with the United States, but also in a resumption of six-power talks with everything on the table. including denuclearization. So that's a long way to ask a question, but what's the alternative? What's the way forward? Why shouldn't we have a comprehensive approach and perhaps make denuclearization just one of the issues? That makes sense. I'm posing that to you, gentlemen.
Well, I think the primary reason is that North Korea and Vietnam and China are very different. Vietnam won its war. That issue was resolved. They won, we lost. And so in years later, we could find ways to engage with them. And it was deeply in our interest, just as with China, to bring Vietnam out into the world economy and see if we can get it captured by the gravity of capitalism rather than communism. In the case of China, they do have an irredentist issue named Taiwan. It's a divided country in that sense, but that issue has faded. And China was in a position coming out of the Maoist period of desperation. They had to find a new direction. And they did so under Deng Xiaoping in 1979. But it's very important to remember that both the Doi Moi reforms in Vietnam and Deng Xiaoping's reforms coincided with normalization of relations with the US. In the case of Chinese reforms, it was almost the same week, a week later. If the US were to normalize relations with North Korea and remove a lot of the embargoes that we have on them, I think North Korea might respond to some of the things that Adlai was talking about. But in the absence of normalization and with the continuing hostility between North and South in the US and North Korea, I think it's unlikely. North and South Korea for 10 years did do a lot in terms of economic exchange, as I said in my talk, from 1998 to 2008. And it's really too bad that the 2000 summit agreement was not followed through by Roh Moo-hyun's successor, because it really bid fair to take all the ports around the southwest from, Kaesong is not a port, but Haeju, and then around the southwest corner of North Korea up to Chinnampo, the port of Pyongyang, and make that all a kind of export zone. It wasn't implemented, unfortunately, but it does suggest that North Korea is interested in the kind of outreach that Adlai is talking about.
Can I say a word about this? The way I think about North Korea and South Korea is in terms of three different periods. One was the Cold War. Two was the period from roughly 1990 up to the present, and then the present forward, okay? North Korea-South Korea relations were deeply enmeshed in the Cold War up until 1989. And in my opinion, there was no way you could have any reconciliation in those years because of the US-Soviet competition and how that manifested itself on the Korean Peninsula. What happened in 1989 is the Soviet Union went away, and we moved into a period that most people referred to as the unipolar moment. And when you use the word unipolar, you're basically saying there's one great power in the world. And of course, that great power is the United States. Therefore, great power politics is largely taken off the table because there are no two great powers to play the game. So I find it hardly surprising that Bruce tells a story after 1990 and up until the first years of George W. Bush's administration, where South Korea and North Korea and the United States were close to having a major rapprochement and maybe putting the Korean War behind them. It's because great power politics had been taken out of the equation. That was our great opportunity, and we blew it. It's all over with now, and that was reflected in Bruce's comments, I think, about what's happened after George W. Bush came to power. But the argument I'm making is that we're now moving into a third period, the Cold War, right? The immediate post-Cold War period, and now we're moving into a period where there's going to be a US-China competition, and that US-China competition is going to manifest itself in all sorts of thorny and pernicious ways on the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, I think there is no hope of getting any normalization of relations between the North and the South in the future, because the situation is analogous to what you had in the Cold War, and we blew our opportunity.
I make one comment.
Dr. Mautner-Markhof.
I think we have very clearly before us what the options are. Either we accept the argument that North Korea will never get rid of its nuclear weapons, in which case the way forward is going to be very difficult. Or we accept that, as they have recently indicated, a willingness to negotiate a comprehensive approach, which ultimately, and I cannot put a date on it, it will not happen tomorrow or even next year, but which ultimately should lead to a peace process on the Korean Peninsula and to a process of denuclearization. This was all contained in the very important joint statement I mentioned in my statement at the beginning. This was perhaps one of the key outcomes of the six-party talks before they no longer were functioning at the end of 2008. The joint statement was indeed a reflection of a comprehensive approach. That is to say, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, a peace treaty to replace the Armistice Agreement, normalization of relations among the countries of the region, that is to say, in particular between North and South Korea, United States, North Korea, and Japan, North Korea, and also economic development and humanitarian exchanges. This statement was agreed to by all six parties. Recently, these parties have reaffirmed their commitment to this statement. So, to my mind, one either gives it a chance and tries to go forward, and it may be that roadblocks will emerge, and then one will say there really weren't two options, there's only one option, and that one option will be that a country decides to have at least a minimum nuclear weapons capability. But there may be some area in between for compromise that will lead to what one would hope would be a situation of stability in the region. Thanks.
Questions from the audience, comments? Yes, sir. Is that Terry Turk? It is. It's Professor Turk of II.
Terry Turk with IIT and the Stevenson Center. I much enjoyed the presentation, I must say. It's really provocative. But by training, I'm an economist, so I would like to present the economist viewpoint. The speakers talk about the Iraq War, and we know that the war has cost the US $3 trillion. And at the moment, I really doubt that the American public would stand for any military involvement in East Asia. Of course, one of the reasons is that we have spent we borrowed Chinese savings to pay for the Iraqi war. Right now, we don't have the resources really to start a new military adventure in East Asia. Secondly, very few of us know that Deng Xiaoping, he invited the Korean leader, the dear leader, what you call him, the supreme leader, to visit Shenzhen to show him the advantages of opening up the economy and introduce economic reform. The same leader visited also Shanghai and other academic centers in China. So China is really interested in opening up North Korea to foreign direct investment. As the senator mentioned, Kaesong stands as a success story in inter-Korean cooperation. And of course, North Korea lives in dangerous neighborhood. But in the meantime, it's a wonderful neighborhood. We have South Korean miracle, we have the Chinese economic miracle, and we have the Japanese with tremendous amount of technology that they could supply North Korea if there is peace. So North Korea could really benefit greatly if the U.S. could give it guarantee that it would not push for a regime change. I agree with what was said about the nuclear situation. Historically, no nuclear country has given up its nuclear weapons. But what could be done is that if North Korea is to be provided with the right kind of incentives, then at least they would stop testing nuclear weapons. And it seems that North Korea right now is really ready to have a change in its economic system. Because if you look at we talked about the generals, the hawks and all, but in North Korea, the cabinet, the prime minister of North Korea is a reform-minded person. And I think we can see that recently Schmidt of Google, he visited North Korea because the North Koreans now are trying to establish a viable international, information technology foundation. So if there is peace, then North Korea would develop economically quite fast. All we need is simply for the U.S. to give guarantee to North Korea that it will not attack it. Stop here.
Thank you. Any response? Any other comments?
Go ahead.
I'll make a couple points. One, as I said, the United States can't credibly give anybody any guarantees that it won't attack it, because the United States has a rich history of giving guarantees and then violating those guarantees. Anybody who believes what any president of the United States says is a fool. Second, the basic assumption of your argument is that if North Korea can get hooked on capitalism, much the way China has got hooked on capitalism, we'll all live happily ever after. Because if everybody's getting rich, who in their right mind would start a war? Because it would be the equivalent of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. All I would point out to you is that before World War I in Europe, there was a great deal of economic interdependence, or what we today call globalization, and everybody was getting rich. Nevertheless, you had World War I.
I think we have comment or question?
Thank you for the distinguished. My name is Bonnie Oh. I'm a retired professor of Korean Studies from Georgetown University. And I have a very simple question. On a recent visit of President Park Geun-hye of South Korea, President Obama and President Park expressed solidarity in refusing most recent North Korea's approach to have some kind of negotiations. But the excuse for Park and Obama's refusal is that it's the same old story, there is nothing new, and North Korea is refusing to do away with nuclear weapons. If we take Professor Mearsheimer's argument, I mean, then there would be absolutely no negotiations because North Korea would not give up the nuclear weapons. So are we missing an opportunity by refusing to accept North Korea's approach to us? Thank you.
Well, I want to say hello to Bonnie Oh, who's an old friend. What I want to say is that, again, if we go back to the late 1990s, one thing I didn't mention that's very important and bears on what John was saying a minute ago about China wanting a buffer state is that the US and South Korea had worked out a scheme whereby American troops would stay south of the DMZ in the context of reconciliation and reunification. And Kim Dae-jung got Kim Jong-il's agreement to this in 2000 at this summit that I was talking about. And that would mean that the US would be the primary great power that would preside over Korean unification, but would not have its troops move north of the DMZ. Kim Jong-il, as you know, Bonnie, agreed to that. And he agreed to it because China and Japan are strong simultaneously for the first time in modern history. Usually Japan was strong and China was weak. After World War II, it was the opposite. Now you have the second and third largest economies on either side of North Korea. And this actually has a lot of resonance with strategies that King Kojong was trying back in the 1880s when Korea was beset by imperial powers. In any case, it was amazing to me that the Bush administration failed to see the logic here of this, because what it does is allow the US to play a balancer role in Northeast Asia with Japan, China, and Russia, and have a guarantee, a clear guarantee of Korean defense, and neutralize North Korea, in effect, neutralize North Korea. All of this has gone by the boards, but it suggests a way in which China might be willing to tolerate not American and South Korean troops on the Yellow River, and I agree with John, they're not going to tolerate that, but rather North Korea with a kind of provincial autonomy within a Korean state where South Korea and the US kept their troops below the DMZ. So let me just stop there.
Well, with that, I'm afraid we have run out of time. I thank our speakers. I thank all of you, including the Consul General of Japan, Mr. Yoshida, for joining us. The way forward remains somewhat unclear, but I remind you that this program today is part of an ongoing project, which hopefully will help the world find a way to peace and maybe denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
John, are you going back to Hyde Park right now?